Right now, sitting inside your cells, is a record older than any family Bible, older than any plantation ledger, older than the name on your birth certificate. It's a record that survived slavery, survived erasure, survived 400 years of silence. And for the first time, science can finally read it. For generations, Black families in America have carried names that were never truly theirs. Names handed down not through love, not through lineage, not through the deliberate naming traditions of a proud African family, but through ownership. A name given by a man who bought and sold human beings the way you might buy and sell livestock. And for 200 years, that name became the only thread connecting millions of people to a past they were never allowed to remember. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere, in a village in what is now Nigeria, or Ghana, or Senegal, or Angola, there was a family with a name that meant something. A name that told you who your people were. A name that carried the story of your birth order, your clan, the circumstances of the day you entered the world, the achievements of your ancestors, the region your family called home. In many West African societies, a name was never just a label. It was a compressed history, spoken aloud every single time someone called you by it. And then, in an act of violence so total it's almost impossible to comprehend, all of that was stripped away. Men, women, and children were taken from those villages, forced onto ships, and carried across an ocean into a system designed to erase every trace of who they had been. Their language was forbidden. Their religion was suppressed. Their names were replaced. Sometimes with the first name of the person who now claimed to own them. Sometimes with a surname borrowed entirely from the plantation owner's own family line. It wasn't an accident. It was policy. A quiet, systematic effort to sever every enslaved person from their origin, because a person without a name, without a history, without a place they could point to and say, that is where I come from, was easier to control. So when we look today at a name like Freeman or Washington or Jefferson or Lee, carried proudly by Black families across this country, we have to understand what we're really looking at. In the overwhelming majority of cases, that name is not an African name. It's not a name your ancestors chose. It is, quite literally, the name of the family that once considered your ancestors' property. That is a hard truth. It is also, historians and genealogists will tell you, simply the truth. It's worth sitting with exactly how deliberate this erasure was, because it wasn't simply a byproduct of chaos or carelessness, it was strategy. Enslavers understood, whether they said it openly or not, that a person who remembers where they came from is a person who remembers they were once free, once whole, once part of something larger than the plantation they now stood on. So the machinery of slavery didn't just take labor. It took language, forcing people who spoke dozens of different tongues into forced silence or into a new, imposed vocabulary. It took religion, criminalizing or suppressing spiritual practices that had connected communities to their ancestors for centuries. And it took names, the most personal marker of identity a human being carries, replacing them with labels chosen by the very people committing the violence. Even the way enslaved people were recorded in official documents reflected this. Bills of sale often listed enslaved individuals only by a first name, an age, and a monetary value, stripped of surname entirely, stripped of family context entirely, as though the person existed with no past and no lineage at all, only a price tag and a present moment of forced labor. For a long time, that truth felt like a locked door. Genealogists searching for Black family history would hit what researchers call a brick wall, usually somewhere around the year 1870, the first federal census where formerly enslaved people were recorded by name at all. Before that date, enslaved individuals appear in historical records not as people, but as property. Tally marks on a bill of sale, a dollar value in an estate inventory, a first name scribbled next to an age and a price, no surname, no family unit, no trail to follow back across the ocean. For most of American history, if you were Black and you wanted to know where your family truly came from, the paper trail simply stopped, and it stopped on purpose. But something has changed. And it didn't change because a historian found a hidden ledger or because a lost archive was suddenly unsealed. It changed because of something far more personal, far more permanent, and far harder to erase than any piece of paper. It changed because of what's written inside every single one of us, coiled up in nearly every cell in our bodies. DNA does not care what name was forced onto your family in 1740 or 1810 or 1850. DNA does not answer to a plantation owner's signature. It carries forward, generation after generation, a record of biological truth that no system of oppression was ever able to touch. This is the story of how that record is finally being read. Not through some gimmick, not through a magic list of 15 surnames that instantly hands you a clan, because that kind of promise sounds appealing, but it isn't how this actually works. The real story is more complicated than that, and honestly, it's more remarkable than that too. Let's start with what DNA testing can genuinely do, because understanding the tools is the first step to understanding the discovery. There are, broadly speaking, two different kinds of genetic testing that matter here, and they answer two very different questions. The first is called autosomal DNA testing. This is the kind of test offered by companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe, and it's probably what most people picture when they think of a DNA ancestry kit. Autosomal DNA is inherited from both of your parents, who inherited it from both of their parents, and so on, reaching back across your entire family tree, blending contributions from dozens, even hundreds of ancestors within the last several generations. This is the test that gives you those colorful ethnicity breakdown maps, the ones that might tell you your ancestry traces to Nigeria, Cameroon, or the Ivory Coast. But the real power of autosomal testing isn't the percentages, it's the matching. When you take one of these tests, your genetic profile gets compared against a massive database of other people who have also tested. And if you share DNA with someone, the test will tell you. Sometimes that match is a second cousin you've never heard of. Sometimes it's someone still living in West Africa, someone whose ancestors were never taken, someone who represents a living, breathing connection to the exact place your family was stolen from centuries ago. People have found these connections. They've reached out. They've built relationships with distant relatives across an ocean their ancestors were forced to cross against their will. That is not a metaphor. That is real, documented, and happening right now, made possible by nothing more than a cheek swab in a database. The second kind of test is different and in many ways more precise, though also more limited. It's called Y chromosome DNA testing, or Y-DNA, and it can only be used to trace a very specific line, the direct paternal line, father to father to father, stretching back through time. Here's why this matters so much for understanding surnames specifically. In most Western naming traditions, a surname is passed down the exact same way the Y chromosome is passed down, from father to son, generation after generation. Which means that if a Black American man takes a Y-DNA test today, he isn't just learning about deep ancestral origins. In many cases, he's tracing the very same line that determined the surname he carries. If his family surname came from the man who enslaved his ancestors, his Y-DNA test can sometimes connect him directly, biologically, unmistakably, to that slave-holding family line. This isn't hypothetical. This exact kind of testing was central to one of the most famous cases in the history of American genetic genealogy, the case that confirmed Thomas Jefferson fathered children with Sally Hemings, a woman he enslaved. For generations, the Jefferson family publicly denied this relationship. It took Y-DNA testing, comparing male descendants of Jefferson's uncle to male descendants of Sally Hemings' youngest son, to finally establish what oral history within the Hemings family had insisted upon for 200 years. The DNA didn't create that truth. It confirmed a truth that had been carried forward through generations of Black memory long before any scientist believed it. And that's a pattern worth noticing throughout this entire story. Time and again, oral history passed down within Black families. Stories told at kitchen tables, whispered warnings, half-remembered names, turn out to be remarkably accurate once science finally catches up enough to test them. DNA hasn't so much rewritten Black family history as it has validated what families already knew, giving formal, undeniable scientific weight to memories that were dismissed or ignored for far too long by the official historical record. That story matters here because it illustrates something profound. Why DNA testing doesn't just tell you about the distant past. In African American genealogy specifically, it can expose the exact mechanism by which a name was forced onto a family, and in doing so, it can point directly at the historical record of the enslaver, which, ironically, is often far better documented than the record of the enslaved person themselves. Slaveholders kept meticulous records, wills, estate inventories, property deeds. If you can connect your Y-DNA line to a specific slaveholding family, you can sometimes use that family's well-preserved paper trail as a backdoor into your own history, following the movements, the sales, the transfers of enslaved people that were documented not as human stories, but as financial transactions. It's a bitter irony. The very system that erased your family's name kept perfect records of the man who erased it, and those records can become a map back to your own ancestors. But surname research and Y-DNA are only part of this picture, because most Black Americans are not looking to trace the line of the man who enslaved their family. They're looking for something else entirely. They're looking for the truth that was taken before slavery even began. They're looking for the actual African origin, the actual ethnic group, the actual region their ancestors called home before any of this happened. And for that search, a different kind of organization has emerged, one built specifically around this need. There's a company called African Ancestry that has built its entire mission around exactly this question, helping people trace their lineage back to a specific present-day African country, and in many cases, to a specific tribe, or ethnic group within that country. Unlike the broad regional percentages you get from a standard ethnicity test, this kind of testing focuses on maternal and paternal lineage markers that can be matched against an extensive database of African genetic samples collected specifically from communities across the continent. The goal isn't a colorful pie chart. The goal is specificity. Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, Wolof, Mende. Real names of real peoples, with real histories, real languages, real cultural traditions, still practiced today by millions of people. For someone who has spent their entire life only knowing themselves as African American, with no more specific place to point to, receiving a result like that can be overwhelming in the truest sense of the word. It's not just information, it's an answer to a question that was supposed to be unanswerable. It's important to understand how this kind of testing actually works, because it isn't magic, it's methodology. These tests typically focus on two specific kinds of genetic material that remain largely unchanged across many generations. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down from mother to child, tracing the direct maternal line back through time, and Y chromosome DNA, passed down from father to son, tracing the direct paternal line. Because these particular pieces of genetic material don't mix and recombine the way the rest of our DNA does, they preserve a remarkably clear signal across hundreds of years, sometimes longer. By comparing these markers against a reference database built from samples voluntarily contributed by people across the African continent, researchers can identify which present-day population shares the closest genetic match. It's not a perfect science. It only traces two specific lines out of the thousands of ancestors sitting in anyone's family tree. But for those two lines, the direct maternal and the direct paternal, it can offer a level of precision that broader ethnicity estimates simply cannot match. And here's something else worth understanding, something that reframes the entire idea of what a surname even means in the first place. In many West African cultures, names were never simply inherited the way Western surnames are. Naming traditions varied enormously from one culture to another, and many of them carried meanings far richer than a family label passed mechanically from father to child. Among the Yoruba people of what is now southwestern Nigeria, names could reflect the circumstances of a child's birth, family aspirations, or connections to lineage and even royalty. A name like Adebayo, for instance, carries the meaning, "the crown has met joy," a name that could suggest a family with ties to nobility or birth celebrated as a moment of triumph. Among the Akan people of Ghana, names often reflected something as fundamental as birth order. A child born third might carry a name like Mensa, marking their place among their siblings for the rest of their life. In parts of Ethiopia, naming followed an entirely different logic altogether, where a person's second name is simply their father's first name, creating a living chain of connection between generations that shifts with every new birth, rather than staying fixed across a family line the way a Western surname does. This matters because it shows us that the entire concept of a fixed, inherited family surname, the kind that gets passed down through legal records and censuses and birth certificates, is itself a European framework. It was never how many African societies organized identity in the first place. So when enslaved Africans were stripped of their names and given the surnames of the people who claimed to own them, they weren't just losing a word. They were being forced into an entirely foreign system of identity, one that had nothing to do with the deeply meaningful, community-rooted naming traditions their ancestors had practiced for generations. Understanding this changes how we should think about the search for identity today. It's not simply about finding out what your real surname would have been. It's about understanding that the entire question of surnames may be the wrong question, and that the deeper truth lives somewhere else, in genetic markers, in regional origins, in ethnic and cultural connections, that were never designed to be captured by a single family name to begin with. Now, alongside these commercial testing options, something remarkable has been happening in the world of academic research, work that's pushing the boundaries of what genetic genealogy can accomplish for African American history specifically. In a landmark study led by researchers at Harvard University, working alongside the Smithsonian Institution and the genetic testing company 23andMe, scientists achieved something that had never been done before. They combined ancient DNA extraction techniques, the kind normally used to study skeletal remains that are thousands of years old, with a massive, modern personal ancestry database, and developed an entirely new method for establishing genetic relationships across that gap in time. The subjects of the study were enslaved and free African Americans who had lived and worked at an ironworks in Maryland known as Catoctin Furnace in the decades immediately following the founding of the United States. Using DNA extracted from historical remains and comparing it against the genetic profiles of tens of thousands of people who had taken a modern consumer DNA test, researchers were able to identify living descendants, connecting people alive today directly to specific individuals who lived and labored at that furnace more than 200 years ago. This wasn't a broad regional estimate. This was a direct, individual, documented genetic link between a person breathing today and a specific human being whose name had nearly been lost to history entirely. The research was conducted with deep sensitivity to the communities involved, guided by ethical principles developed specifically because so much of the history of genetic research has, historically, treated black communities as subjects rather than partners. This study was different. It was, at its heart, an act of restoration, an attempt to give something back that had been deliberately taken away. Consider what that actually means for a moment. Before this kind of research existed, a person who labored and died at that Maryland ironworks 2 centuries ago was, to history, essentially anonymous. A line in a ledger, perhaps, or a name on a burial record if they were lucky. There was no way to connect that person forward in time, no way to say with confidence that a specific living human being today carries their blood, their memory, their unfinished story. This new method changes that completely. It means a person alive right now can learn, with genuine scientific confidence, that they descend from someone who lived and worked and endured at that specific place during that specific era. That is not a vague regional estimate. That is a name, a place, a life, restored to a family that never stopped wondering. Researchers at Stanford University have been working on a related but distinct problem, one that speaks to just how limited even the best modern ethnicity estimates really are. Standard genetic ancestry tests can tell you, in broad strokes, roughly what percentage of your DNA traces to different global regions. But they generally can't tell you much about the specific people in your family tree who contributed that ancestry. They can't tell you how many African ancestors you likely have, how many European ancestors, or roughly when those lines converged. Stanford researchers developed a new statistical approach specifically designed to estimate these numbers for African American family trees, essentially reconstructing a more detailed genealogical picture of the mixing of African and European ancestry that occurred, often under horrific and non-consensual circumstances, during and after slavery. This kind of research doesn't just satisfy curiosity. It gives historians and genealogists a genuinely new tool for understanding a period of American history that written records almost entirely fail to capture with any accuracy or honesty. All of this raises a bigger question, one that goes beyond genetics entirely, into the emotional and psychological weight of what it actually means to reclaim a lost identity. For generations, being African American has meant carrying an identity defined largely by absence, not by what you know about where you came from, but by what was taken from you and never replaced. No family crest, no village to point to on a map, no definitive tribal or ethnic name to claim as your own with certainty, just a surname that, more often than not, belonged to someone else entirely. That absence isn't just a historical inconvenience, it's a wound that gets carried quietly, generation after generation, showing up in the simple, universal human desire to answer the question, where do I really come from? Think, too, about the sheer scale of what's happening here. Millions of people across the world have now taken a consumer DNA test, and a significant portion of them are Black Americans, specifically searching for exactly this kind of connection. Every single new person who tests adds another data point to the database, another potential match waiting to be discovered, another thread in a web of connection that grows denser and more precise with each passing year. A match that seemed impossible 5 years ago might suddenly appear next year, simply because someone new, somewhere in West Africa or the Caribbean, or right here in the United States, decided to take a test of their own. In that sense, this entire field of discovery is still unfolding in real time. The full picture isn't finished. It's being built, one test kit, one saliva sample, one curious person at a time. This is why, for so many Black Americans, receiving a DNA result isn't just interesting trivia. It's emotional in a way that's difficult to fully explain to someone who has never lived without that answer. People have described opening their results and seeing a country, a region, sometimes even a specific ethnic group, and feeling something shift inside them permanently, a sense of grounding that they didn't know they were missing until they finally had it. Some have gone on to visit those regions in person, walking through villages and cities their ancestors were violently taken from, closing a loop that spanned centuries and an entire ocean. Others have found living relatives, people who share their exact DNA markers, people whose ancestors were never taken, and built real, lasting relationships across that unimaginable historical divide. None of this erases the pain of what happened. No test result can undo the horror of the transatlantic slave trade or the deliberate cruelty of a system built to sever people from their own history. But it does something else, something quietly powerful. It proves that the erasure was never actually complete. The people who stripped away names, languages, religions, and family structures believed they could sever a people from their origin entirely, permanently, irreversibly. They were wrong. The connection survived, not in any archive, not in any courthouse record, but in the DNA itself, passed down silently through every single generation, waiting for the technology to finally exist that could read it. So where does that leave the question we started with? If you're a Black American looking at your own surname, wondering what it means, wondering where your family truly came from, here's the honest, complete answer. Your surname alone almost certainly cannot tell you your ancestral clan. In the vast majority of cases, it's not an African name at all. It's the name of the family that once enslaved your ancestors, adopted during or immediately after emancipation, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes as a quiet act of defiance and self-naming by people finally claiming legal identity for the first time in their lives. That's not a comfortable truth, but it is the real one, and understanding it honestly is far more valuable than any list promising instant answers. What can actually reveal your deeper origins is the combination of tools we've talked about here. Autosomal DNA testing, connecting you to living relatives and broad regional origins. Why DNA testing, tracing a direct paternal line that can sometimes expose the exact slaveholding family whose name you now carry, and through that family's records, open a door into your own family's documented past. Specialized ethnic ancestry testing, the kind offered by organizations built specifically around identifying African tribal and ethnic origins with real precision. And now increasingly cutting-edge academic research, combining ancient DNA with modern databases to connect living descendants directly to specific enslaved ancestors whose stories were nearly lost forever. This is not a 15-second answer wrapped up in a clickable list. It's a genuinely complicated, genuinely emotional, genuinely important field of science and history working together to solve one of the deepest wounds in American history, the deliberate erasure of an entire people's origin story. And piece by piece, generation by generation, test by test, that erasure is being undone. The record was never actually destroyed. It was only ever hidden, written into the smallest, most permanent part of who we are, passed down through blood, through cells, through a molecule too small to see and too resilient to erase. For 400 years, the world tried to convince an entire people that their history began on a slave ship, that everything before that moment was gone forever, unreachable, unknowable. Today, for the first time, science is proving that story wrong. The past didn't disappear. It waited patiently, silently, inside the smallest strands of who we are, for the day someone would finally know how to listen. And now, one test, one match, one connection, one restored name at a time, it's finally being found, and it's finally being told.